So I'm standing in front of the marker that shows the location of the Haskell Home Cemetery here in Battle Creek, Michigan. The Haskell Home was Battle Creek's last orphanage, and there's a whole story behind that. This was the cemetery location, and there are more than 50 bodies buried here. There are no more headstone markers. All that remains is this monument. So let's explore some of the forgotten history of Battle Creek. Come along and join me. To begin to understand the history of the Haskell home, we have to go to the person that first conceived of the idea, and that was John Harvey Kellogg. Now, John Harvey Kellogg was a medical doctor, a nutritionist, an inventor, and overall a health activist. He was the director of the Battle Creek Sanitarium, which was funded by members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. The sanitarium was a facility that had been established in 1876, and during the 2 decades before the establishment of the Haskell home, it had become the largest institution of its kind in the world. It treated both the rich and the famous, and also the poor who could not afford hospitals. Dr. Kellogg was a leader in progressive health reform and wrote extensively on science and health, combining scientific knowledge with Adventist beliefs, promoting a regimen of vegetarianism, nutrition, exercise, even enemas and sunbathing and hydrotherapy. He believed in abstention from smoking tobacco and drinking alcoholic beverages, and his beliefs also included a healthful diet of whole grain foods, fruit, and vegetables, which were incorporated into the meals at the sanitarium. So there's an entire whole history of the sanitarium, which I intend to do at some future video. But just to give it in context, Dr. Kellogg first conceived of the idea in 1891 of a Battle Creek orphanage as a result from his work at the sanitarium, where over the years the population of the city had grown. There were a number of orphans on the street, a number of people sending their children to the sanitarium, as well as over the years he and his wife Ella, who had no children of their own, had adopted over 40 children at one point. So he approached the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and they liked the idea. They also wanted to establish a home for the elderly. So they placed Dr. Kellogg as the head of the committee. Although the original resolutions for just one home that would include both orphans and the elderly, they eventually expanded the idea to establishing 2 separate homes. And they began fundraising, but the fundraising was going slow. In 1892, Caroline Haskell was visiting the Battle Creek Sanitarium with some friends and was impressed with the operation of the vast complex, and she called on Dr. Kellogg to find out more about his work. In that meeting, she expressed to him how impressed she was with the facility and wanted to make a donation to the sanitarium and its projects. Surprised about the generous offer, Dr. Kellogg began to tell her about the different ways to donate to the sanitarium, and Mrs. Haskell informed him that she was interested in doing something quite larger than that. So further conversation, the doctor presented his project about the orphanage. Mrs. Haskell became very interested, asked to examine the plans. She recognized that they were insufficient for the purpose and sort of embraced the idea of taking on the project herself. So she told Dr. Kellogg that she was going to fund the entire project herself at the cost of $30,000, which was a lot in those days, provided that it might stand as a memorial to her deceased husband. She explained that Mr. Haskell had reared some orphans in his lifetime and took them all the way up to adulthood and helped them get out into the world. She had the plans redesigned to a larger orphanage building and gave the money outright. She only made 2 stipulations. One, that it be named after her husband, thus it became the Haskell Home, and the other was that it be a non-sectarian institution. She herself was an Episcopalian. She had considerable respect for the Seventh-day Adventists, but she wanted to open it up to all denominations and for people of all backgrounds. So the construction began on the Haskell Home, and at the same time, the Seventh-day Adventists continued fundraising to establish the Home for the Elderly, which was also built around the same time and became known as the James White Memorial Home. The Haskell Home for Children was opened in 1864. At the beginning of this video, I was standing on the site of the Haskell Home Cemetery. That was originally platted in 1899. I thought I would take a moment to show you on the map of the city of Battle Creek where these two different places were in reference to today, and then I'll show you here on this map in the blue square is where the Haskell Home Cemetery is off Limit Street on the campus of the Battle Creek Academy. Over on the corner of Parkway and Hubbard in this orange boxed area, which is now platted into neighborhoods, was the original site of the Haskell Home, which at one point was over 67 acres. Here's how it looked on the 1894 Calhoun County Atlas, and here's how it looked on the 1902 Sanborn fire maps, and then also again in 1907 on the same fire maps. I'm showing you these maps for reference so that you can understand where the building of the Haskell home was in relationship to the cemetery. Please don't go knocking on doors of neighbors. There are no remains of the Haskell home still standing in that neighborhood. The architectural model for the Haskell home was exhibited in the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893 and recognized as the grandest institution in Battle Creek after it was completed. The building faced south and east 117 feet on each side and was 3 stories and an attic above the basement. The foundation was wood, brick veneered. The caps and sills of the windows and other trimmings were of buff limestone. The roof was half-pitch Gothic. On each side were 2 dormer windows with 2 on the back side. Ventilators were located at the west and north ends. There was an imposing veranda 14 feet wide and 12 feet high, and the whole length of the west and south side, a total of 300 feet, which made a pleasant promenade. There were 4 entrances to the basement and 4 to the first floor. The main entrance was at the south corner of the north wing on the first floor facing Hubbard Street. The building consisted of dormitory rooms for the boys and the girls. There were reception parlors, assembly room, a gymnasium, and a Sloyd room, which was used for woodworking and crafts. There were 3 school rooms, lavatories, private rooms for the matrons, rooms for the rest of the staff, a library, and there was even a quarantine room for at times when children were sick and needed caring for. The daily life and curriculum at the Haskell home was developed by Dr. Kellogg, and from the beginning it was the purpose of the managers of the home to make it more of a genuine home for children than had ever been attempted before in similar institutions. The entire group of children, which the building could house up to 150 orphans, they were divided into families of 12, and each family had in charge a missionary, mother, or caretaker. Every person connected with the home, from the cook to the caretakers and the teachers, were undertaking their duties with a complete course in training at the sanitarium. The purpose would be to make the home not simply a temporary stopping place for children, but a place in which boys and girls could be exposed to culture and trained to a self-supporting age and receive a good education and develop any skills and individual talents that they might be able to acquire. An 1894 article in the Battle Creek Daily Journal quoted Dr. Kellogg as follows. In regard to the Haskell home, he said it was the intention to rear the children so that every girl would become a Venus and every boy an Apollo. It was proposed to give them such an education as to make them whole men and whole women, true and pure. The girls as well as the boys will be taught trades. The institution had no endowment and no debt, but was dependent upon donations for its support. The children were taught skills such as farming, carpentry, baking, cooking, sewing, and many other skills, in addition to Bible study, classroom study, and even allocated playtime. Over the years, the Seventh-day Adventists published the Haskell Home Appeal in an effort to help raise funds for the orphans and the aged home. The sanitarium was destroyed by a fire in 1902, and Dr. Kellogg was pressured to rebuild the sand elsewhere but he decided to continue and rebuild it in Battle Creek. And this time he built it out of a solid stone structure that we know today that is still standing in Battle Creek as the Federal Center. Ellen White, the founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, had wanted the sanitarium rebuilt in California or some other location. This began a series of events that ultimately resulted in Dr. Kellogg being asked to resign from the congregation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in 1907. Dr. Kellogg was disfellowshipped, and he made no effort to fight their unanimous decision. With this split, almost all denominational support for the Haskell Home and other SDA projects under Dr. Kellogg's control was lost. After 1907, Dr. Kellogg took responsibility for fundraising for the Haskell Home personally. The children brought to the Haskell Home were from a variety of nationalities, races, and personalities. They came from what was said to be the lowest and most forlorn conditions of life. According to the 1900 census, the places of birth for the children at the Haskell Home were from 25 of the 45 states at the time in the United States. Not all the children were orphans, but all came from families who were desperate and no longer able to care for their children, even if just temporarily. One child traveled over 200 miles by train with a note pinned to his jacket reading, "Please help me to Haskell Home, Battle Creek." He was found crying at the train station, taken to the sanitarium, where they eventually took him over to the Haskell Home. The challenge of gathering children of all ages from destitute homes and introducing them to education, faith, etiquette, and basic manners was an admirable goal. In reality, complete success can be hard to gauge. Many of the children welcomed their new family that cared for them, while others resented their removal from the only world that they knew. This second group of children often engaged in delinquent activities, sometimes around the Haskell Home neighborhood and in downtown Battle Creek, doing everything from stealing bicycles, taking horse and buggies on joy rides, stealing money, and sometimes just running away. Despite the occasional miscreants and delinquents, the city of Battle Creek, business owners, and members of the community donated generously over the years to the Haskell Home to keep it in operation, and the children supplied with clothing and gifts at Christmas time. But the whole history of the Haskell Home came to a tragic conclusion on the early February morning in 1909. The superintendent was awoken by his wife in their room on the 3rd floor, the same floor as the boys of the Haskell Home. She explained to him that there was a fire. The room had been filled with smoke. Alarmed, they ran down to the boys' room and gathered them up and began ushering them down the stairs amid the total darkness to the safety of the exterior. Mary Armstrong, the oldest girl in the school, awoke suddenly, discovering the 3rd floor section where she was quartered was filled with smoke. Below could be heard the crackling of the flames. The female dormitory was in the northwest corner of the building, and the two means of exit were by the back stairs and an outside fire escape. Mary groped her way through the darkness to the back stairway to find escape impossible because of the dense smoke and flames that were licking their way to the top floor. She discovered that the outside fire escape in another part of the building was impossible to reach as well. Mary woke the girls and then sprang them from their beds. The floor beneath them was so hot that they were unable to stand on their bare feet. Several climbed onto chairs. Gathering the small girls around her, the older girl felt her way to the back of the room where everything was burning, to a window on the west end of the room, and told them the only thing to do was to jump. Below, she saw her brother James, age 14, with most of the boys who'd been ushered to safety by the superintendent. He was standing on the roof of a coal shed 2 stories below. I'll show you in the picture here where I believe she was standing and where they were standing on top of the coal shed. Mary didn't waver. Seizing 2 of the smaller girls, who happened to be her sister, she held them down as far as she could go and let them drop into the arms of her younger brother. 7 of the other little ones, clad only in their night clothes, jumped the entire distance to safety, miraculously escaping injury. The last 2 girls to stand by the window were Mary Armstrong, Cecile Coutant. Unable to withstand the stifling smoke any longer, Mary jumped and landed on the roof of the coal shed 25 feet below. She struck her head on the ground and her fall stunned her. Cecile was too scared to jump and ended up succumbing to the fire, along with 2 other children. Cecile was last seen standing at the window. She took a step back and there was a loud crash, and then she disappeared from sight into the fire. The other 2 children that died that evening was Lena Mckelvey, age 14. The other girls did not remember seeing her in the confusion when they were attempting to escape, so she may have never made it out of her bed. The other child that perished in the flame was George Goodnow, age 10. He came from Chattanooga, Tennessee. He was a black child, and it is said that he had the habit of wrapping himself up tightly, head and all, in his blankets at night, and had to be repeatedly cautioned about this. Perhaps he was afraid of the dark, but he never made it out of the boys' dormitory that evening. There were 37 children in the building the night of the fire. All except the 7 who jumped and the ones that were dropped from the window escaped by the stairs. The smoldering embers of the fire lasted for almost a full week. In the weeks that followed, there was a lot of speculation as to whether there was arson, a lot of references to Ellen White's prophecies being included in the newspaper articles where she had prophesied that she saw a sword of fire overhanging Battle Creek several years earlier. And they also listed out several of the SDA connected properties that had burned over the past decade. There was also at the same time the search for the remains of the children that perished in the fire. Ultimately, there wasn't a full investigation. Fire investigation is not like we have today, and there was roughly over 100 fires in the city of Battle Creek alone in 1909, most of which were caused by coal fires and sparks from the coal furnace. The heating systems of that period were a lot less safe than they are today. Fires were frequently caused by sparks from the heating system, such as coal or wood, and combine that with a wood building and enclosed ventilation systems. It's very easy to see how these sort of fires were quite prevalent in the day. Partial remains of 2 of the children were ultimately found when excavating the basement rubble, and there were bone fragments found throughout the search. All 3 children were buried in the same casket at the Haskell Home Cemetery. Over the years, the Haskell Home Cemetery was the burial spot for children from the Haskell home, elderly from the James White Memorial Home, as well as indigent people in the community. The headstones were mostly wooden in the early days, which accounts for many of the headstones no longer being in existence, having deteriorated with time. There are some pictures of the Haskell Home Cemetery taken in the 1930s and 40s that shows some of the stone headstones that were there at the time. Over the years, the headstones have either sunk or been stolen by vandals. The cemetery records for the Haskell Home Cemetery were lost somewhere in the 40s or 50s, so there's no accurate account of who is buried there. It is estimated there are approximately 50 bodies. There's been a lot of research done by people on findagrave.com that have included some of the names of the people they've confirmed through newspaper articles and other public records. Dr. Kellogg had vowed to rebuild the Haskell home, but more on a smaller scale, more of a cottage plan. The immediate solution was to refit the pump house and laundry room for housing for the children. In 1910, Dr. Kellogg decided to plat the Haskell home grounds into building lots, and the children were moved into a country farm. Portions of the old property were sold along Hubbard Street, and then in 1926, it was announced that the Haskell home property was transferred to the Battle Creek College. The powerhouse and laundry building were ultimately razed in 1933, and in 1943, the National Housing Administration constructed 100 temporary houses between Hubbard and Welch Streets to relieve the housing shortage. Mayor Bernard Good suggested the name of Haskell Homes for the project, reviving the memory of the former orphanage that once located in that vicinity. In 1949, construction crews digging cellars for residential homes on Bernardo Place, located halfway between Hubbard and Jordan Streets, discovered the foundation and some of the charred wooden remains of the original Haskell home. In 1989, the stone marker that we see here today was set in place at the site of the Haskell Home Cemetery. Over the years, many articles have been written about the history of the Haskell Home Cemetery in the various Battle Creek newspapers and the Haskell Home Orphanage, as it is an indelible part of the history of Battle Creek. If you're looking to learn more about the subject, I highly recommend the book that was published in 2020, The Haskell Home Orphanage Tragedy, Battle Creek, Michigan, published by James N. Jackson. I consulted with him in the making of this video, and he mentioned to me that over the years he's been trying to get one of the local universities to come out with ground penetrating radar to help locate some of the original graves if they're still there, and maybe some of the sunken headstones to perhaps do some sort of future restoration on the site. If the project was ever undertaken, I'm sure it would be fascinating to find out what they might discover. That's going to do it for today's tour of history at the forgotten Haskell Home Cemetery and the history of the Haskell home. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, please take a minute to leave me a like, leave me a comment, and subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.